Welcome to Carolyn Braden's Turning the Ordinary into the Extraordinary. Today I'm going to show you how to shibori dye a dress. This is the dress we're going to be dyeing today. I purchased it on Amazon for about $23 and it's a beautiful long summery dress and it's nice and comfy, but it just doesn't have that extra something special. So I'm going to be using a shibori dyeing technique called marbling, and I'm going to scrunch this fabric together, put some rubber bands around it, and dye it in some black dye. Americans actually get tie-dyeing from shibori. Shibori is a type of Japanese dyeing. There's a link right above here on the video that shows you another video where I explain a little bit more about shibori on a show I did called That's Clever for HGTV years ago. And so if you watch that one, you might learn a little bit more background information about shibori. So here's what you need for this project. For this project, you will need some old clothes yourself or an apron. You'll need some rubber gloves. You'll need, this is called urea. You need some of this soda ash fixer. You need some textile detergent. I am using Synthropol. This is what I used when I did dyeing in college. My teacher told me all about this and it works really, really good. You need some fiber reactive dye. I am using hot black and I purchased mine from the Dharma Trading Company. You need some old measuring cups, some glass ones, plastic ones, but make sure you only are using these measuring cups for dyeing. You don't want to cross-contaminate the things that you use in the kitchen with this. Some old tablespoons and teaspoons. You need some rubber bands. You can also use plain waxed dental floss to do your bindings, but I'm going to use rubber bands today. You need some plastic bags. You need some vats to catch the dye, or an old bowl would work just fine. The method I'm using today is also going to require the use of a squeeze bottle. You don't have to do your dyeing this way. You can actually just go to the grocery store, get some RIT dye and some salt and some hot water in a bucket and get your fabric and bind it up and put it in a vat of RIT dye. The reason why I'm not using RIT dye today is because I want this design to last. RIT dye works just fine. I used it in the classroom when I taught and my students' projects turned out just fine, but we weren't as concerned with them lasting for years like I want this textile to last today. Before you start binding your fabric, you need to make sure you've washed and dried your garment. You wash and dry your garment because basically fabric is made up of fibers that are kind of like this. Before they're washed, they have a lot of holes and gaps in them. It's just how they're made from factories or anything that's handmade. They're kind of a loose weave. When you wash it in hot water, which is what I recommend, it makes this, which is called sizing, it makes the sizing shrink, and that will hold the dye better. If a garment is like this, your dye will just pass through all of the holes and the gaps. By washing the fabric, it will close some of those gaps so your dye actually will adhere to the fabric better. It's just a little trick I thought you might want to know. So if you've already washed and dried your fabric, it's time to start the marbling technique. Now, there are folding techniques where you can fold and you can bind going this way. Marbling tends to be easiest. So marbling, I'm just going to twist the fabric into a bunch, and then I'm going to take my rubber band and I'm going to put it all in the same area until it's nice and tight. And if you have any fabric sticking out, you want to make sure you get that all sealed off, just like that. I'm going to go to another section. I'm going to bunch that up, kind of swirl it, and then put my rubber band on it. The cool thing about dyeing is every time you do it, you're going to probably get an effect that's different. People worry sometimes so much that theirs isn't going to turn out right, and what you need to realize is that everybody's is their own technique. Even though this is called marbling, mine is going to look different than someone else that does the exact same method. So don't be as concerned with yours being perfect. just have fun with it and see what design you can come up with. I've actually come up with several techniques on my own that have created kind of flower effects, and they're kind of neat. So sometimes your mistakes become cool things that you can use again in the future. Make sure you get your bindings really tight. If they're not tight, the dye is going to go right through that, and then you're not going to get any kind of pattern. It's just going to end up being a solid dye color. So we're just going to continue doing this effect. I'm going to do it on the front of the dress and then on the back of the dress and do it all the way down. This is probably going to take some time, but it's going to be worth it. I've been varying my technique a little bit. Earlier I said you can get them all the rubber bands all in one section to maybe block off a little bit more of this fabric that's sticking out, because these will create like rings all around it, and some of this may get dyed too much. So I'm going through in some of where I've got these sections just all together. I'm actually moving some of the rubber bands on top of some of the loose fabric to create more resistance. Anywhere where your rubber band is binding the fabric, that's going to create a white section, and then all of this loose part will be black. So the more you bind, the less dye can penetrate through your fabric. So that's just the look I'm going for. You may want little circles all around yours. I want mine a little bit more spidery looking, so I'm going to bind it even tighter. So far I have the front of the dress. I may go back in and do some more little rubber band areas, like I see an area here that's free. I may even use some of the wax dental floss. This will create even more binding or resistance for the dye. So like I said earlier, create your own methods. And if you are working on a method that you think you may want to use again, my teacher in college always said, write it down, use a journal, say exactly how you did it, provide pictures or videos. Well, this is my video proof of a method. That way you don't lose track of what you did, so you can recreate it. I think this is kind of cool. This could be like some kind of an avant-garde dress. Interesting. I'm going to keep going now on the back side. We're getting close. Before I finish this, I just remembered that I haven't told you what kind of fabric that I'm using. This is a rayon spandex blend. From my research, rayon takes on dye in a very intense way, so hopefully that will ring true. So when I undo this, I'll have some nice vivid dyes. Cotton works really well to dye, of course, and silk as well. So just do your research. If you've got a fabric that you want to dye and you're not sure how it will take dye, just Google it and you'll be able to find out if it dyes well or not. You can also do a test. You can get a roll of fabric and cut off a piece and try dyeing it and seeing how well it dyes. I actually did that in some of my fiber arts classes in college and found that certain fabrics dye better than others. And sometimes you don't want a fabric to dye very intensely. So if you're looking for a less intense of a dye, then choose a fabric that suits that look you're going for. So I finished the binding part with the rubber bands, and I still feel like I want to bind even more. So I'm actually taking some of that waxed dental floss, and I tied it onto one end, and now I'm just going through anywhere where I think I want to create even more resistance. I'm wrapping the waxed dental floss around that area. Again, I'm not really sure what this is going to turn out like. It's going to give a marbled effect, but it's going to be the Carolyn Braden marbled effect. So if you want to use the dental floss to create even more resistance, go for it. If not, just stick with the rubber bands, and then you're going to stick it in some soda ash fixer, which will help the dye adhere even more to the fabric. And we're going to do that next, coming up. Again, get those bindings tight, because if you don't have them tight, then everything will just get dyed one solid color. I've actually had that happen before, and it's kind of sad and lets you down when you take your bindings and you have no design at all. I'm back, and it's all bound, and it's ready to go into a soda ash bath. I've got about 2 gallons of hot water in this first vat, all filled up, ready to go. Now I've got to add the soda ash. What the soda ash does, and if you order this from Dharma, it says right on the package, soda ash is a fixer and it makes your dye permanent. So if you're using a dye like RIT, you don't need to use this. You can, it would probably make it last maybe a little longer, but I am using that with these fiber reactive dyes. So safety first, when you are using chemicals of any kind, you should definitely wear gloves. So I'm gonna get my gloves on, and you need safety goggles, and you need a mask. Hopefully you'll be able to hear me with the mask on. I'm gonna try not to explain too much with the mask on. All I'm going to do is put 2 cups of soda ash in this measuring cup, put it into the 2 gallons of water, mix it up, put the fabric in there, and let it sit for 5 minutes. Here we go, steaming up my goggles. Since I didn't quite get my water deep enough, I'm going to let it soak for 5 minutes on one side, and then I'm going to flip it over and let it soak for 5 minutes on the other side. While my fabric soaks, I'm going to go ahead and make my dye. I've got a glass measuring cup that I only use for fiber arts and dyeing. And I've got my dye in hot black. I've got my little squirt bottle and urea and a tablespoon and a dust mask and gloves. So let's get started. The directions from Dharma say when you are dyeing with black dyes, you need to also use salt with your urea. The urea actually helps the dye penetrate the fabric. Again, it's not necessary if you don't want this to last forever, but this is just to get a nice, bright, vivid color, and you want to get that dye to penetrate the fabric and to really, really dye it well. So I've got my salt, and now I'm going to fill this up with hot water. This is 1 cup. I'm going to dissolve the salt. So I've got the water and the salt. I'm going to get that going in there. The directions also state that when you are using a black dye, you should use a lot more, 2 to 8 tablespoons. For this, I do need to have my mask on. I actually only had about 5 tablespoons of the black dye, so I'm just going to go with that. Now it's time for the urea. I'm going to do 1 tablespoon of the urea. It looks like little white pebbles. I'm going to use a teaspoon, so it's going to be 3 teaspoons. I'm doing this in a vat. That way I keep my mess here. Now we're going to put the dye into the bottle. Put the cap on. All right, I can breathe. That mask is hard to breathe with. I know there's probably other masks out there, so next time I'll try to get a better mask. So I've got the dye in the bottle. I've got my vat ready to go. I've got my fabric over here that has soaked, and you don't need to wring it really dry. It's fine if it stays wet. I'm just gonna slightly wring it just to get a little excess out. I'm gonna bring it over to my vat, and I'm gonna take my bottle and I'm gonna start squeezing dye on, and it instantly, you can see it penetrating the fabric. It's really cool. I'll bring the camera up close so you can see that. Here's how it looks up close. You're just squeeze bottling on the dye. Now remember, this is not how dark it will be when you rinse it out, so don't be afraid to really get it on there. If you don't want all over color, you don't necessarily have to. You could just kind of spot dye it like this, or if you're using multi-colors, you can mix up different colors of dye and put them in here. Like if I wanted to do black and brown, I could, or pink and blue would probably work. You want to use colors that will complement each other, especially if they're mixed. Like if you were using purple and yellow, unless your color that you're after is like a grayish brown, you might not want to do that. So if you're using more than one color, definitely make sure that they are colors that complement each other. The cool thing about using the squirt bottle is you can get into little teeny tiny areas, whereas if you're using a bucket of water, it may actually create air bubbles and you may not get to all your spaces. So that's why I like using this method for this particular project. Now we are going to put the dyed fabric into a plastic bag and let it sit overnight. You can let it sit for about 2 hours. I'm just gonna let it sit for 24, but during that 24-hour period, it does still need to stay moist. So we're gonna take this fabric here. I didn't use all of the dye, which is fine. Saving the dye to do another project, if you're gonna do within a couple of days, probably will be okay, but saving it for a long period of time after it's already mixed up, it won't be super effective. This is why I've got my plastic tarp down to catch any drips. I've got this fabric in the first plastic bag. Now I've got a plastic garbage bag. I'm gonna put it in just to make sure it doesn't dry out. And then we'll let it sit and come back tomorrow. Now is my favorite part of the entire process. It's the unveiling of my creation. I'm taking it out of the bags after I let it sit for 24 hours. However I let it sit for 24 hours, I'll never know. It was like waiting for Christmas morning. So it's set in there and it's still wet. So what you do at this point is you take Synthropol, which is a textile detergent. We put this in the sink. I'm going to use my laundry room sink and run water over it. I'm just going to do it with very lukewarm water with a couple of capfuls of the Synthropol. And what's cool about the Synthropol is what it will do, it will suspend the dye. It'll just kind of make the dye stay like this instead of moving around when I start unbinding it. You want to rinse because when you start unbinding this, you don't want the dyed areas to jump to the non-dyed areas. So you don't want this dye, because obviously there's still dye on here. You don't want that to get onto the white areas of your fabric or the non-dyed areas. And so the Synthropol will help suspend your dye and prevent the bleeding onto the white areas. So I'm going to set this in my sink and start rinsing. And I'm going to rinse until the water turns clear. Get all this dye out. Another quick tip when you are rinsing, try not to move around your rubber bands or anything, because at this point there's still dye, and even with the Synthropol you still just need to be careful not to wring it or twist it, because you might destroy the design that you have created. I got this rinsed as good as I could. As you can see, there's still some dye coming off of this, and that's fine. I did use the Synthropol and got it to come off as good as I could. I'm just going to wipe this away as I'm undoing the bindings. So I will start with using a little pair of scissors. Be super careful at this point when you're undoing the bindings so you don't accidentally cut your fabric. Sometimes unraveling the bindings can take as long as it took or longer to actually create the bindings. It's best to start in one area and work your way around so you don't get things tangled up too much. So far I've got one little section done and I'm really liking this look. Okay, so I've got the whole thing undone and I like the design. It's very marbled. Now it's time to rinse it out again with some more Synthropol, and then I'm going to machine wash it again and then hang it to dry, and then we'll come back to see the final results. The dress is dry and I love how it turned out. It got a little bit away from traditional shibori dyeing methods, and that's okay because that's what creating an art is all about. I used some of the traditional binding methods to create my own design. Here's the front of the dress and here's the back. The hot black turned out pretty nicely. There are some areas where it's kind of navy and some areas where it's very, very black. And so that's why it was very beneficial with me leaving it for 24 hours. That way the dye could really penetrate and look really, really nice, bright, and vivid. This dress should stay looking this nice, bright, and vivid for years as long as I wash it and probably hang it to dry. I could dry it in the dryer, but not with this kind of fabric. So take some of the methods I'm teaching you in this video and combine them with some of your own and come up with your own tie-dyeing shibori method. I was afraid some of these white areas may not turn out so great, but they did. I think using that synthepol really was helpful. Thanks for watching Carolyn Braden's Turning the Ordinary into the Extraordinary. Don't forget to subscribe and leave me a comment if you have any questions or if you have any ideas for any upcoming craft videos. Bye!
Visit Carolyn'sBloomingCreations.com